Good evening. If one of the goals of this conference has been to facilitate communication and to facilitate connections between people and institutions, then the fact that it's difficult to get people to stop talking is a good sign, because it means that people have found people to talk to and exactly those connections. They say in English that there's no free lunch. And it turns out that there's no free supper either. And the price you all have to pay for dinner is to listen. But we have tried to make the listening tonight to be a little less formal than our usual panels. And for that reason, we've invited Professor Sheizaf Rafaeli of the University of Haifa, of the Institute, the Center for the Study of the Internet, from the Faculty of Management, from Links, the Learning Network Society. You hear all of these terms and you start to realize why there have to be connections between what Professor Rafaeli is working on and the kind of things that we do, because if one of the themes that we've been talking about is getting material online and making it available, and how do we get people to use it, and how do we enable people to use it in ways that will push forward research agendas and the learning agendas of the broader population, then we really have to understand something about the way in which information technology is affecting reading, and also is affecting how managers, how people toward the top of the pyramid are making decisions, and how that gets used. So that's, I think, part of the great substantive reason why Professor Rafaeli has so much to add to us. And in addition, he really is an exciting and colorful speaker. So without further ado, I want to ask Professor Sheizaf Rafaeli to address us. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoel. Give him a round of applause, because among other things, he's also responsible for our title tonight. I was on the other side of the world, literally, when we were debating this, and Yoel jumped in with the suggested title, which really, although it is that long, that's not the talk, that's just the title. I'm told that this collection of people is unique for a variety of reasons, one of which is that what you have are librarians along with archivists, along with people from museums, which is an interesting combination. It's especially interesting to me because several years ago, Owen, maybe you can remind me when, I gave a talk to the National Library folks, and I started that talk, which was about technology and digitization and why I think that is the most important thing in libraries and museums. Started that talk with a proposed Gedanken experiment, a proposed thought experiment. And I said, suppose the lost Ark is suddenly, surprisingly found. My question to the group assembled then was, if the lost Ark, along with its contents, is suddenly uncovered somewhere, where is its natural place? Should it be placed in a library, or should it be placed in a museum? I proposed this Gedanken experiment as an introduction to a discussion of what libraries should contain and how they should be organized, what museums should contain and how they should be organized, and whether there's a distinction. What I've been asked to talk about today is somewhat related to this, although not entirely. We're going to need... Tom, I'm going to need you to do the page down here because this is not working. Just give me one page down, please. Tom? Okay. So I hope everyone is sitting close enough to see the picture. It's a picture I use often in my talks to introduce the question, why are you smiling? What in this picture brings up reasons to smile? Is there a dissonance here? Does it have to do with technology and age, or does it have to do with some other reasons? Tom, let's hit the page down again. With this audience, thank you. With this audience, I won't need to spend much time on the imperative to remember. From what I understand, what most of you do, you can lecture me about how important it is to remember and commemorate and preserve and deal with all of those tasks of keeping memories. And yes, today is the 5th of November. Those of you in Anglo-Saxon countries would catch the reference, remembering the 5th of November. Those of you attuned to the Israeli culture should know that yesterday and today are days of memory in other respects. We had a national day of commemoration for Rabin this past Saturday. We're going to have another one this coming Saturday. In between, we have a day of commemoration for Rachel Imenu, or Rachel. Memories all around. But I'd like to recommend a movie that I think most of you have not seen, that I think sheds an interesting light on commemoration. If you get a chance in the next few months, go see The Pracht Inn. Has anyone here seen this movie? It's a brand new movie. It just came out. It's an Israeli production that deals with commemorating and preserving Yiddish. It's about a whole chapter in Judaic culture that may or may not have come close to disappearing. It's, I think, a very poignant movie, and it's in line of this discussion of the imperative to remember. You might recall in Yoel's title, that was the beginning. Everything will be going downhill from here on. Tom, if you hit the page down, I will say that when we talk about the evolution, as this picture maybe proposes to suggest graphically, there is some development away from the imperative to remember in some directions that might be surprising. Tom, let's go with another one. Tom? Thank you. The process I would like to highlight is a process fueled by a transition from analog to digital. Those of you sitting close enough can see that this area has analog pages. The bridge over the chasm is a bridge that leads to the digital area. The transition from analog to digital, a transition that accompanies most of our areas of endeavor. In my field of education, in my other field of business and management, in any other field of professional work, and in your fields of museums and libraries, are all undergoing this transition from analog to digital, and this transition is affecting some preconceptions that we used to have and we are now changing. Tom? This transition from analog to digital. You just use the page, okay. I apologize. This says up here, it says, the biggest shift since the Industrial Revolution. There's a drawing of what looks like a sun rising or a dawn rising. It's a picture that not I am the person who made it, but it reflects the position taken by some people who look at this transition from analog to digital in very hopeful, optimistic, and forward-looking eyes. Tom, if you hit the button again, some of this transition is the transition represented by the motion from Gutenberg to Zuckerberg. What I'd like for you to do is to keep in memory the little picture down here. Gutenberg, as we all know, is the poster boy or the icon for transition from handwritten scrolls and other manual forms of books to the codex and printed books. Zuckerberg, in many ways, is the poster boy for transition from books to whatever comes after books. We'll look at this for a second, but first we'll make a stop at one more station, and that is the argument that this optimism, the argument that the transition from analog to digital is the biggest thing since the Industrial Revolution. This argument is accompanied by a long list of considerations we need to take into account. We need to think about the difference between data, information, and knowledge. We need to think about interactivity and interaction and the opportunities represented by sharing. We need to think about wisdom of crowds and what that represents for us who deal with information and knowledge. We need to think about long tail and multimedia and multitasking and gaming and gamification and networks, both people networks and content networks and semantic networks. We need to think about the new business models that are brought about by much easier copying and dissemination. We need to think about the resulting novel intellectual property arrangements that we need to deal with. We need to think about other ways of organizing information, including nonlinear ways and hypertextual arrangements. We need to think about synchronicity and asynchronicity, which are characteristics of communication and information that are now changing. We need to think about packet switching, a few more words about which in just a second, and we need to think about memory. And what I promised to talk about today is a little bit more about memory, but first, I want to say I am not alone in being optimistic about many of the changes brought about with these new technological affordances. I recommend David Weinberger's book, Everything is Miscellaneous, for anyone in the library or museum or archival professions. If you haven't read the book, Weinberger is from Harvard Library. I'd recommend our own book called Network and Net Play. There are quite a lot of people who talk optimistically about the changes that are brought about. Are we moving? Okay. The single most important concept to understand in the transition from analog to digital is this notion of packet switching. Packet switching is the technological characteristic of networks that brings about many of the optimistic predictions, many of the rosy views, many of the sun rising and dawn arriving readings of our current era. Packet switching says that we are no longer going to be in centralistic situations. Packet switching says that the way in which people access information is changing in front of our eyes. Packet switching is the core of the prophecy or the promise of new digital dealings with content. However, not everyone is as optimistic. This little picture that I showed at the bottom of the slide earlier of the transition from the codex to a technological alternative causes us some concern. Those of us who have our identity deeply rooted in the book, those of us who call themselves people of the book, need to ask what's going to happen when the book is no longer with us. For those of us who speak Hebrew, you may know that it's not just the people of the book, Am HaSefer, it's also the school, the house of the book, that is probably already undergoing quite a traumatic change. So people of the book and house of the book and the very notion of knowledge, Ladat Sefer, to know the book, all of these are being challenged by what should have been a easier transition represented by analog to digital. So there are quite a few critics. People say, when we're becoming more digital, are we almost by definition also becoming or making everyone else more stupid? Is Google making us stupid? Is the motto of this statement. A book written by the person who coined the original headline, Is Google Making Us Stupid?, is this book called The Shallows, referring to what the author of the book, Nicholas Carr, also from Harvard, believes is happening with these new technologies. Not a new dawn rising, not a new opportunity, not packet switching, but rather internet is changing the way we read, think, and remember, and making all of us a lot more shallow, says Nicholas Carr. Tom? Carr has his opponents. Clay Shirky's Cognitive Surplus takes the other side in this debate, and if you're ever interested in looking more deeply into optimistic versus pessimistic, utopian versus dystopian views of the transition from analog to digital in our field of collecting and archiving information, you may want to read these two sources and contrast them. What I'd like to point out, though, is that they're both talking about cognitive spheres, whether shallow cognitive spheres or cognitive surpluses. If we look, Tom, if we look at what all of these are, and the next one as well, Tom, the next one. If we look at what collects together much of the work on technology and humans using the technology, we find memory, different conceptions of memory and different measures of memory and different ways of implementing memory at the core of this conversation. If we want to look at computers and people using them, if we want to look at collections of information and people using them, if we want to look at digital treatment of information, it all converges to discussion of memory. In fact, the history of technology in the last 30 years is well summarized at the bottom here with the various technologies that represented memory. Older tapes, and then disks and diskettes, and then disks on key, and now the cloud, an evolution of memory that is probably the most important thing in framing how we think about technology. Tom? In addition to memory, what we need to take into consideration is the amount of data that gets collected. More and more things watch, record, smell, sense, and in general collect more data about us and about our environments. This thing called the Internet of Things, the next technology about to arrive at our doorstep, is an internet of a lot of data that needs to be read, sifted, analyzed, retrieved. A world of data that is exploding in quantity and pace. So if we had time, we would run a little seminar on how we thought about memory over the ages. I'd like just to highlight the fact that memory has been thought about and remembered by different generations in different ways. Plato, through his writings about Socrates, made memory the most important human trait, more important than writing, and in fact, he defames writing. We move on through writings by Aristotle and Cicero, Tom, and we can look at medieval concepts of memory and how memory emerges to be something entirely different in Renaissance and Enlightenment periods. The reason I want to go through this real quick summary is to bring us to modernity and late modernity, when memory is taking on an entirely new focus, entirely new set of responsibilities. Let's do another slide. Everyone's talking about big data. And the talk about big data is the talk about memory. It's the talk about there being a lot of information being accumulated at paces that you as librarians probably know a lot about. We are probably not doing very well in keeping up with. The question is the attention paid to big data and its accumulation, is it the correct attention? Are we looking at the right things? What we're beginning to see is a growing wave of critical thought focusing on big data as a threat. We're beginning to hear from every corner discussions of the big problem of privacy. We're beginning to hear questions about whether, rather than thinking about this data accumulating and being of use, whether we should, as Victor Mayer Schoenberger's book titles it succinctly, whether we should do less collecting and archiving and preserving and remembering and commemorating. Maybe we should be doing more deleting. Bringing this big word, delete, to a conference of librarians and archivists and museum specialists requires some courage. I wonder how many people here have read Schoenberger's Delete. Since very few have, let me just tell you what the punchline is. Schoenberger's response to big data, to the accumulation of information in various forms, to the various results of sensors and cameras and microphones and so forth, is to issue a call to everyone who has the ability to do so to think about what should be deleted. The subtitle is The Virtue of Forgetting in the Digital Age. Schoenberger's own personal biography provides a little bit of an explanation for this. He says, among other things, the extermination of Dutch Jewry was the most efficient in all of Europe during World War II because the Dutch were also the most efficient in keeping records going back and allowing the discovery of who is Jewish. That's the story. The conclusion is delete. Schoenberger is not alone. If you look at the analysis of memory through the lens of public decisions, in the case of the next 3 short stories, through the lens of courts and legal treatment, you can see that this theme of let's delete is becoming more and more prominent. So while we start from a Plato that almost worships memory, we are now at a state where we have various examples of people and institutions and ideologies not just not revering memory, but actually declaring war on it. This little slide is about a current public storm in Israel that has to do with repressed memories. There's a conversation going on in the press and in the public sphere about whether restored repressed memories can or should be used as evidence in court. There's a large activity by dozens of psychologists, including Nobel Prize winners, who represent one side of the question. There has been a decision by the Supreme Court following several stages that take the other side. The upshot, though, is memory is suddenly being maligned. The next case is a case that has to do with another decision by our Supreme Court, a precedent in which the Supreme Court, in short version, decided that privacy is more important than freedom of speech, and has therefore ordered the removal of a book from stores' shelves, a book that has already been sold, several hundred copies. So the secret is out. The cat is out of the bag. What we have left is only the discussion of the theory or the ideology. How important is memory and the ability to represent it, and what happens when you juxtapose it with privacy? And the third case has to do with this building. I wonder how many people recognize this building. I made a little bet with myself that no one would recognize it. What does the structure of the building make you think of? Twin Towers, okay. Books, okay. Maybe I'm old, but when I looked at this, it looked to me like a punch card back from computer memory times. Sorry? Well, what it is, these are the Twin Towers of the European Courts of Justice in Luxembourg. And the European Courts of Justice in Luxembourg are of interest to us because it is at the European Courts of Justice in Luxembourg that, again, just in the last few months, the decision that elevates the right to be forgotten was brought up. The European courts issued this interpretation of EU law, an interpretation that requires, in the case of their particular verdict, requires Google to erase links to other sites outside of Google, outside of Europe as well, that mention things that people mentioned in them don't want mentioned. The title, The Right to be Forgotten, against the backdrop of the importance of memory and an ideology of recollection and commemoration and preservation. The title, The Right to be Forgotten, is incredibly important. I spent most of my time in thinking about this presentation, in thinking about what would be an appropriate image, graphic, that would represent the right to be forgotten. I came up with this particular cartoon, and it's for you to judge whether it is appropriate or not. The right to be forgotten, for some people, is a major step forward in the preservation of privacy. It allows, as was the case with the plaintiff in this particular court case, it allows people whose criminal records are old enough to request an erasure of those criminal records. They can't actually erase those criminal records, but what they can do is petition Google or other search engines to no longer link to them. It's important to understand that a large part of the world doesn't like that decision. In fact, the headlines this week that tell of an interesting attempt to make use of that verdict by a pianist who didn't like a review of his performance and asked the newspaper and is now asking Google to remove references to that unfavorable review, are an example of taking the right to be forgotten to a certain extreme. We can have a discussion about a person's ownership of their own history. We can have a discussion of the legal interpretation of someone's relevance to what is said about someone. What we cannot have a discussion about is whether any of this has any real meaning, because it is clear to everyone involved that when the dust settles, nothing will be forgotten. The technology, and in particular, packet switching technology, will not allow things to be forgotten. So what's left for us to deal with is the philosophy and the moral implications, not the technology. And to highlight or emphasize this, let me move on from the story about this pianist to the question, can we erase the past? Should we erase the past? Do we have the right to be forgotten? According to most legal jurisdictions, with the exception of the European one, no, we don't. And most importantly, can we have a right to be forgotten, or is this already a done deal and over with? I'd like to share with you a court case that I'm a part to. These are legal papers served to me this week again. Those of you who can read Hebrew and are sitting close enough can see that the heading says, I'm named here as someone who's being sued, and the heading says, urgent, very important, that's the first letter. Urgent, very important, second letter is the second letter. Urgent, very important, third letter is the third letter. There's about 12 hours between each one of these letters. The letter is addressed to me and a few of my friends by the mayor of a mid-sized town here in Israel. What the letter is about, it has to do with our being the board of directors of the Wikimedia Foundation. That's the foundation that supports Wikipedia and activities there. And what these letters are about is the mayor not liking what Wikipedia says about him. And they are demands that we remove whatever is said about him unfavorably. Also, one of the letters demands that we allow whatever his spokesperson uploaded to Wikipedia. 3 or 4 things that are illustrated by this, and the letters are worded in threatening tones, rapidly escalating threatening tones. So here's the question. 1, is there any chance these sorts of demands would be acted upon and succeed? In other words, is there a right to be forgotten? 2, should there be intervention? Supposing, what isn't true, but supposing there really were a way, legally and technologically, for the board of governors of the Wikimedia Foundation to actually intervene and force a particular piece of content. Should that be allowed? Should, in this case, the person whom this addresses have the recourse to have history erased? The specific request he has is that we remove references to a very critical passage in the state controller's report of his activity, none of which we had anything to do with adding, and none of which we will have anything to do with erasing. The right to be forgotten, for example, in content collections and repositories such as Wikipedia. Not very likely technologically. I would like to argue long-term, not very likely even legally, but I would like to argue most interestingly, very, very troublesome, because it is now all over the place. It's a mayor here and a pianist there and a Supreme European Court in a third place. So when the New Yorker writes about this, they say the solace of oblivion, and it's a discussion of the right to be forgotten. I think a good way of responding to this in the age of packet switching, in the context of a transition from analog to digital, in the period when what we have with information is this mega explosion called big data, the right way to take a look at this is, I would like to propose, through the question, do we have the right to forget? So we actually had 3 statements, and what I'd like to propose to you as people in your profession is to connect through these 3 statements. There's an imperative to remember, there's growing talk about the right to be forgotten, and I think a major part of the response is to raise the question, do we have the right to forget? In a week like this, where I mentioned we have several occasions to commemorate historically in different cultures, in the context of technology that makes it all but impossible to succeed in forgetting, do we have a right to forget? My answer is a resounding no. I don't think we have a right to forget. What I did was put together here a series of references, everything from Negroponte's Being Digital book more than 20 years ago, through the very recent books by Christakis and Fowler called Connected, and Morozov's called To Save Everything, Click Here, and The New Digital Age, for anyone who's interested in reading more and thinking more about these issues. But even if you want to not deal with these, I think this is another thing we do not have a right to forget. It's happening. Big data is happening and engulfing all of the collections of data, information, and knowledge that we work with. Internet of Things is going to even further and more rapidly accelerate this process. So the question of the interaction between memory and forgetting, technology and collection of information is not going away, it's actually speeding up. So to come back to the Lost Ark. Suppose the Lost Ark is discovered. And suppose we settle the question whether it should be in a library or a museum. Do we not see that there will be those who would like, forget it? Will there be, for example, murderers, rapists, adulterers, and others who would consider themselves maligned by the Ten Commandments? And would they appeal to some Supreme Court asking for the right to be forgotten? And whether it's analog or digital, what should our response be? Thank you.